Hello everyone, today we talk about the Caliphal army organization during the early Middle Ages. That is essentially the history of the Islamic armed forces during this phase comprehended between the beginning of Islam and the 11th century, let's say. Naturally, it's a very vast topic, as you can imagine, also not just in time but in space. So today we will be summing up the military organization of armies that of countries that stretch from Morocco's to Afghanistan, and it's naturally simplified, but mostly we will be observing naturally the Abbasid Caliphate military. That was the largest power at this time, albeit not at all times, because in fact there were many changes, as we will observe. The strength of these powers kind of fluctuated but we will mostly stick to that also because the Abbasid Caliphate is fundamentally the greater heir in many ways of the Byzantine and Sasanian military traditions that in fact the Arabs came to collect after they invaded the respective territories of Syria, Mesopotamia, etc. And we will observe that in fact, at least in the first generation in Islam, there's a certain a consistent part of Muslim forces was made up by people who had been trained into also in the Roman and in the Sasanian armies. However, going by order, let's say that the major change in the military organization of the Arabs when they went out of the Arabian Peninsula is naturally the increasing multiracial character that they came to acquire with the Caliphate of Muawiyah from 660 and 680. Arab armies ceased to be, in this sense, say, let's use this adverb, purely Arab in composition. Actually, Arabia also saw a lot of mercenaries from different countries. We will see how some of them could come from very far. So this idea of pre-Islamic Arabia, or the Muhammad's times, Arabia was a kind of isolated world where nobody went, or that was not connected with the surrounding regions, is definitely not true, and this is to be borne in mind when you want to study their military traditions, as a matter of fact. Muawiyah, as you know, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan was the first caliph of the Arab dynasty of the Omayyads that ruled from from the 7th to the 8th century. He was a Qurayshite, and he was also brother-in-law and cousin of Muhammad, and brother-in-law of Muhammad and cousin of also the Orthodox Caliph Uthman. And he, in fact, entered in politics in order to take revenge of the assassination of Uthman by the followers of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and by being backed by the Arab army of Syria, he fought Ali and his followers at Siffin, and after a sort of arbitrate was recognized as winner from by one side of the community. And when Ali was assassinated in 661, Muawiyah, also thanks to his political and diplomatical skills, came to be the ruler of a great part of the Islamic conquered territories, and he proclaimed himself caliph, ruling until his death in 680. And there is all in the Islamic tradition is his picture of as a wise and equilibrated man that basically won the caliphate for his own family, and he also was supported by very capable collaborators like Ziyad ibn Abi and his brother, and that was his brother and the governor of Iraq. and he managed in this way to consolidate a vast empire, fundamentally, in spite of the tribal anarchy and the ambitions of the other Qurayshite chieftains, laying therefore the basis of the Umayyad state with its capital in Damascus, and ensuring 1 century of life to his own dynasty. And the Arab armies at this time become increasingly composed by foreigners as well. Naturally, let's say true Arabs kept being included in the Islamic armies, and the preference was given in this sense to those Arabs who had initially had fought for Muhammad in the religious Ridda wars. You know that the Ridda war, Ridda in Arabic means apostasy. So it was the idea of the coming back to a previous custom, say pre-Islamic one. So this even sense of disbelief into the Islamic religion, and Ridda, in fact, in this Islamic vocabulary, designs the rebellion that happened just after, a few times after the death of Muhammad, of several Arab tribes that, thinking that, of themselves tied only personally to the Prophet, refused the obedience of Abu Bakr, that was the first caliph and successor of Muhammad. And they basically were eventually annihilated in the Battle of Al-Yamama in 633. So those who had fought against this, apostates, as they were considered, were naturally those who eventually came even to acquire higher prestige into the Arab army, because of also the holiness, naturally, that the whole thing entailed. Here, they're not properly Arabs now. We're talking about Islamic people that naturally were encompassing now ethnic Arabs, but a lot of other troops that now were necessarily to be recruited in these vast areas that Islam had conquered. So it was conquering at that moment. And there are very important ethnical components in this process, like the Iranians. Iran, the Persians will be extremely important, massively important in Islamic civilization. Actually, the Arabs came to adopt many customs and traditions, even the military ones, as we will see, of the former Sasanid Empire, was lands that they came to occupy, but in turn being sort of absorbed locally by the Iranian culture. The Khorasanians, so these people of northeastern Iran, that also had a very fascinating story, and kept being in turn kind of a central power on their own. The Iraqis, that naturally, together with the Iranian plateau, fundamentally Mesopotamia, roughly today's, in this sense, respectively, Iran and Iraq, came to be the bulk, incidentally, of the Abbasid Empire, of the Abbasid Caliphate. And you realize also, naturally, Mesopotamia was the large, fertile, millenary, developed land of great civilizations, of very large, of urbanization, fertility, etc., that could support a state, a permanent army, a centralized administration. That is, in fact, what the Persians had been expanding in, just like they try to do today, by the way. Certain things in history never change from the Iranian plateau into Mesopotamia, practically. And therefore, these were the major components that eventually stuck, especially to the what would become the Abbasid Caliphate. The initial center of power being at this time under the Umayyads, chiefly Syria with Damascus, etc. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before we go on. But there were other ethnic components in this very, in fact, already, very culturally and ethnically composed area of the world. There were several Indians in the Islamic armies at this times, and therefore we are talking principally of those areas that were part of the former Sassanid Empire. From our Western perspective, usually we think mostly of the losses that the Byzantine Empire had. So they were quite important indeed, like the Egyptians, like Egypt, Syria, etc. But actually, the larger bulk of lands that the Arabs came to expand in were, in the initial phase, were in fact the Sasanian ones. That encompassed fully. Then, of course, towards the beginning of the 8th century, the Arabs have conquered also North Africa, and they enter into Spain, so they expand also to the west. But the real bulk of power was in fact this area of Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, etc. So there were many other elements: Egyptians, Copts, Syrians, that were in this case all inhabitants of the ex-Byzantine provinces. The Berbers that we have, as we have seen with the conquest of North Africa, come to be hired regularly by the Islamic rulers of that region. So they were principally tribesmen, as they were traditionally, and converted to Islam in the at least from the late 7th century. But even in the Islamic world, the Maghreb was considered kind of a very heterodox area at best, because these Berbers were considered, even from the more advanced civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt and Syria, kind of like the not really barbarians, but kind of primitives that also had superstitious beliefs that were reminiscents of paganism, etc. Indeed, the Islamization of these lands, just as Christianization had occurred into previously, still in this area, but also in the rest of Europe at this time, was very progressive, initially very superficial. So these ethnic differences started even to mold the internal political identity and orientation. That's why, in fact, the caliphate went to disintegrate. When we talk about the Abbasid Caliphate, we're talking about it depends. Really depends on the periods, but they it kind of shrank at one point fundamentally just to Mesopotamia from previous time that was actually way more, where it compassed all, like the northwestern Africa, parts of Caucasus, of the Arabian Peninsula, the Iranian Plateau, Transoxiana, etc. And just remembering that also the nature of power in here was somewhat nominal. In most of the cases, it was sometimes there is this idea that Islam brought to a recompactation of these territories of the Near and Middle East, but as a matter of fact, it caused the exact contrary, because those had been, at least in the previous centuries, relatively homogeneous entities governed either by the Romans or by the Persians. And with the Caliphate, you realize that as soon as it overstretches, everything starts crumbling in the middle, and the Islamic world get extremely fragmented from a political point of view. There were also cultural religious reasons at that point also for this, because Islam has a very, let's say, troubled relation with constitute power and all these things. So this is important to bear in mind also for the military organization, because talking about something unitary is practically impossible and actually wrong from a strictly historical perspective. There were, in fact, other, what was the relation in this sense with non-Muslims or with some sects within the same Islam that weren't really backing the official power of the caliphate. But well, this is particularly interesting because from one side we have the the Mawali, that that were essentially, the term Mawla or is singular, Mawali it should be plural, is the Arab term that has a very in its various meanings, because also Arab has many several semantic shades. It means either lord or master, at the same time kind of client and kind of freed person. So it's very ambivalent in many ways, and it comes to define this clientelary system that was at the base of every society at the time, basically. It was naturally more pronounced in those more kind of tribal milieus, let's say, but weaker in the states, like the Byzantine Empire or something like that. But fundamentally, all this world at the time was a clientelary world. So when the Muslims started to expand in this world that naturally was not Muslim at all, was either Christian, either Zoroastrian, sometimes still polytheistic, or whatever you want to call it, sometimes even still animistic, by the way, because the borders of Islam, even geographically speaking here, are immense, and they come to attract peoples. We'll see that especially with mercenaries that come even from the most unimaginable places. So especially in the first and second century of Islam, the Mawali had an enormous political and social importance in Muslim society, because there was this matter of people who still remained with their own faith. You have just to pay a tax to the local Muslim government that was usually a much lighter tax than what, for instance, the previous Byzantine administration was, and that's also why so many actually areas of the Near East fell so easily in the hands of the Muslims, because it was more kind of they found the gates open by the same local inhabitants. And therefore there were at all times there were also the converts that initially didn't have naturally the same social status of the Muslims that were already Muslims since the origin. So you have a plethora of very different religious groups that participate within the Islamic armies at this time, including Christians. Christians fought extensively into the Muslim armies, just like many Muslims fought for the Christians alike at this period, in this period, and therefore and there were also other religious groups within the same Islam that were considered extremists, that had also seceded from the unity of the Caliphate, from the Ummah, principally the Khavari. The Khavari were fundamentally this. Today they were actually the member of school that appeared in first century of Islam during the first fitna, that would be the civil war within the Rashidun Caliphate, which had in fact brought to the rise of the Umayyad dynasty that basically overthrew the Rashidun, and that corresponds to the crisis of leadership after the death of Muhammad. And in the very first battle, let's say that this revolt had broke out against the Caliph Ali after the arbitration with his rival Muawiyah that we talked about before, that decided the succession to the caliphate following the Battle of Siffin. So Akari, a group of were assassinated Ali, and they and for 100 years they would remain at the margins of the caliphate, let's say, as a potential insurrection force. Actually, were a threat. They were enemies of the caliphate, but at the same time, they also participated, given the political balance that could change, into the caliphate as warriors. They now the beliefs of the Cavalry can be, can find them on Wikipedia or stuff. I don't know what, but they fundamentally believed that any Muslim, even those who were not Quraysh, so the Quraysh were, the mercantile Arab tribe that historically inhabited and controlled the Mecca and the Kaaba, so that there was all these, but not even an Arab could be the imam, so the leader of the community. If he was, above certain moral standards, fundamentally, and therefore, if the leader sinned, it was the duties of Muslims to oppose and to depose him. And this is to be found. It's a problem to be found even in Christianity, many other religions and beliefs, etc., that broke to that fragmentation of the political unity of the caliphate. But still, at this time, the Cavalry, living at the outskirts of the Islamic world, still were kind of, participating within the internal struggles, and therefore, even formally disconfessing the caliph, they were fighting for it as mercenaries and etc. As it always happens. So even the strict religious differences were, were wrong. What I forgot to say about the Mawali, that in my, it's my understanding that they were effectively kind of important masters of certain communities, etc., that furnished troops to the Islamic troops, and these could be Christians or converted non-Arabs, or still even well, actually, before I said that could even be pagan, but and this happened as well, although the Muslims still attributed to communities like the Christian or Jewish one this kind of almost equal level of respect, at least given that they had their own holy scriptures. So fundamentally, they were partly just we're talking still about Abrahamic, the Abrahamic stock, etc. So when the Islamic power expanded over especially the Byzantine territories, this meant that lots of Egyptians and Syrians also started to serve the Arabs, and these communities chiefly supplied the bulk of Arab fleets. You know that areas like Lebanon, since the time of the Phoenicians, and then Egypt, etc., were fundamentally navally oriented. The Byzantines the Romans had built their lots of infrastructures, of ports, etc. So what happens is that as soon as the Muslims seize these ports, they start using the same docks, ships, military naval engineers, crews that, by the way, were largely, especially in the early period after the Islamic conquest, they were Egyptian Christians. So most of the sailors of the Islamic fleets that came to besiege even Constantinople, for instance, several times were Christian. Actually, they naturally were even different because of the kind of the heresies that had spread, in fact, exactly in those regions, and in part had brought to the opposition to Constantinople. But it's still important to remember. In fact, in the Arab sieges of Constantinople of 668, 675, and 716, 717, they supported the Arab troops against the Byzantines. The majority of non-Muslim troops in the early period were usually infantry, while the arm of cavalry remained principally Arab. This is kind of understandable because the Arabs made an extensive use of mounted troops. Not much traditionally, I believe. I mean, cavalry definitely existed in pre-Islamic Arabia, etc. But they that especially, well, yeah, okay, the semi-nomadic, yes, populations of Ijads were definitely, as shepherds and etc., they made extensive use of mounted troops, but especially it was the very fast expansion of Islam that had also brought these armies to be increasingly mounted. This happened in all great empires, like, in the Roman one, eventually in the Carolingian one, that, the larger your borders are, and the more you have to go back and forth, and therefore this combat-ready mounted contingents have a very great importance, and they come to define fundamentally also social status. That is the status of the conquerors, that naturally also the one that became rich with the conquests, etc. Recently I was thinking also about the general military context of the migration era, at the end of which fundamentally the Arabs broke out from their peninsula. That probably had a very important effect. I mean, the Arabs had lived at the outskirts of the Roman and the Persian empires that had been clashing now, and that had made extensive use of cavalry, sometimes also of Arab cavalry. Just thinking about the Lakhmids or the Ghaznanids, that were respectively clients of the Romans and the Persians, and that were trained in the same Roman army, in the respective armies, and that eventually joined the same Arabs after actually having opposed them initially. So there was this, you may expect in this fact Arab warfare to be a bit kind of isolated and primitive, non-influenced, etc. But I believe that the migration era culture of the steppes also had such a vast influence on the Arabs since the very early period. So infantry would be mostly made up of levies from the subject communities that were largely sedentary, by the way. So, regions like Mesopotamia or Syria or Egypt were definitely regions of millenary sedentarization, with cities, with middle classes, etc. So these weren't used to the rough life of the frontier of the semi-nomads, etc. Well, the Arabs in this sense took pride from it as warriors and conquerors. So at least initially this difference is pretty marked. There is also, however, to observe that the Arabs started to make extensive use also of foreign cavalrymen since the very early beginning. It seems that as early as 653, for instance, there were 50,000 Christian Armenian cavalry that were requested by the Muslims to serve. And the Armenians were, at this time, between the Caucasus and Persia, were massively influenced by the steppes culture. They had pretty solid. They had a sort of, feudal system on their own. They could feel this very effective cavalry, and when the Muslims start pressuring them in exacting tributes, etc., they were also obliged to send mounted troops. So naturally, this military participation of foreigners could happen in different ways. There could be naturally, as in this case with the Armenians, high political reasons for pushing these populations to participate, to prove their loyalty to the rising caliphate, etc. It was a power to be reckoned with. You couldn't really, that was difficult, let's say, to ignore. But there was always, and this was a character that existed in the Arab armies since the beginning, this idea of joining the armies of the conquerors as raiders, as robbers, for booty, fundamentally. So in every kind of army at this time, there were people who joined just to sack, to loot, and this is in a nutshell the history of all, military history in many ways. And the Muslims were usually paying, especially rewarding just with booty, the non-Muslims and the Mawali. So fundamentally, these were kind of a B series troops that not being Muslim were just paid occasionally in this sense. Naturally, it's a gross generalization, because as we will see, that there were different methods of payments and in every relation with these troops from the central government brought to different measures. But that was the tendency, like, the booty, the loot, the violence could be left to these non-believers fundamentally, and while the Arabs would seize for them the main, the land, the cities, the centers of power, and so on. That was a very clever way just to increase numbers fundamentally, that within the limits of reasonable from a logistical point of view is definitely pretty convenient in terms of numerical superiority, etc., increasing strength, etc. As we were saying before, the Cavari were particularly were living at the outskirts of the caliphate, let's say at the frontier with the non-Islamic lands. There is also this geographical dimension of Islam that follows, as we were saying before, also these tracks of the possessions of the great empires that had preceded Islam in those regions. So let's say that aside from the great plains of Mesopotamia or the fertile valleys of Egypt, etc., there is, both the Maghreb and the Mashrek are pretty mountainous, rocky areas, right? And with a lot of mountains, so this frontier warfare that for the technology of the time naturally brought to a standstill the advance towards these areas. Well, the Cavari, as kind of outcasts from the Sunnah, were dwelling there, both for the sake of their own protection from the same Orthodox Muslims, and for the opportunities that could seek in the raiding the frontier communities in this way. So, as it often happens, these frontier troops were often regarded as kind of substantially superior fighters to the average Arab, because they were more used to continuous frontier warfare, right? So they had a higher military average substantially, and they also were regarded, because of their fate, of their minority, therefore with this impelling sense of threat, of danger, of being ready to fight against the biggest power. They were also renowned for their fanaticism and their willing to fight to the death for the holy cause, etc. So these were the Cavari can be characterized in this way. They seemingly were distinguished when joining the caliphal armies with different outfits, with different dresses, although it's not really clear in what way. However, it seems that another religious group of extremists, the Quramids, definitely wore red clothes, and Cavari standards are seemingly regarded to have been red. So this color red seemingly record among these communities. I would like to spend a moment just for the Quramids, that are also very interesting group, because these were Iranians, and they were a religious and political movement with its roots actually in pre-Islamic Persia, in the movement founded by Mazdak, that was actually a Zoroastrian priest, an Iranian reformer, prophet, and religious activist, let's say that gained influence under the reign of the Sasanian Emperor Kavadi the First. So this group was fundamentally now Muslim, if I understand it correctly. That however, let's say it had the mixed characters of Shia Islam and Zoroastrianism, and it maintained this idea of the just the other day we were talking about Mazdaism, Manichaeism, etc. So they are the beliefs of the Quranids have to do with this idea of the belief of the contrast between light and darkness, the principle of the universe in which is the light, and which a part has been effaced and has turned into darkness. So all these kind of exoteric and mysteric beliefs that especially characterize Persia, and both before and after the Muslim conquest, and that really reveal you that with the complexity of the Muslim world at this point from a political and religious point of view, that we're in fact all at once, while Christianity fundamentally had in itself the separation of church and state, in at least in spheres of pertinences. With Islam, it's all way more complicated, and this was a factor that added to the instability of the area, and that in fact even triggered a lot of warfare because of this reason, and that was fueled also by these beliefs that naturally pushed these fighters to commit themselves for their cause. So, as we were saying before, the Islamic armies of this period received a massive, and really, I can't stress this enough, a massive influence from the Byzantine and Sassanid military organization, for many reasons. As we were saying before, some Arab tribes had been already trained by the Roman and Persian Empire at the very beginning of the Muslim era. Some of them were, in fact, initially Roman and Persian soldiers that fought against the Muslims and eventually were defeated, conquered, and reabsorbed by them. The Romans had, as we were saying, also the Muslims came to occupy basically all the Persian lands, whereas just a part of the Byzantine ones. So they mostly inherited especially in the eastern part of their domains, a Persian model of military organization, especially in the same Persia that they had conquered, right? For instance, the warrior class nobles of the Asbaran, that was the bulk of the Sassanid military, and made up the Klibanari heavy cavalry, were now employed fundamentally by the Arabs, and brought in fact this element of heavy armored cavalry that otherwise the Arabs fundamentally didn't have in terms of cataphracts. I made a video on the Sassanid Asbaran. If you want to search for it, I created a Persian warfare playlist that can be interesting. So if you want more details specifically about the Asbaran is actually a very generic term, but in this case we use it to define what we call the cataphracts. It's not that Arab armies at this time made an extensive use of cataphracts, not even, we actually at least have a very few evidence of Muslim cataphracts at this time, even into Persia, because the average Persian cavalryman was, by the way, a kind of a half-armored, soldier, cavalryman. Especially his horse was half-armored, etc. But we see, especially with the Ghulams that came from the steppes, we'll see afterwards, there were many, in fact, real cataphracts coming from Eurasia that were starting being employed also by the Muslims. But traditionally, the Muslims maintain a kind of at the heaviest half-armored cavalry, at least the evidence that we have. And surely there were cataphracts of some sort, especially in Persia, but we're still kind of the ultra elite, and eventually it was problematic to kind of field them in a regular army, whereas Persia remained a kind of decentralized area that had a massive cultural influence on the Caliphate, but was still kind of fragmented in many ways in its feudal organization that had always distinguished it from the surrounding areas. So these troops were mustered just as in terms of during coalitions with relations of dependency from kind of quasi-feudal dependencies from the local caliphs, official, for instance, etc. But they never quite belonged to a military system that was, centrally using consistent bodies of cataphracts on its own. Also because at this time, just remember that Eurasia is, exhausted. Like even the areas that the Muslims came to conquer, it was effectively because they didn't have any manpower, economical resource to oppose. Like that's why the Muslims had it so easy to sweep into the Byzantine and Persian territories, because effectively resources were extremely low now there, and therefore also fielding a cataphract is something that you can do only if you're an enormous power with an enormous with an extremely efficient tax system that is well structured. And at this time, despite the Muslim world was definitely developed and kept structuring its power, having large bodies of cataphracts was extremely difficult, and they came to be revived chiefly towards the end of this period, towards the 11th century, even like the 10th, 11th century, like the Byzantines did. But the Muslim troops were tendentially always kind of lighter than the average Byzantine ones. Not that in the sense that we're talking about there weren't heavy cavalry there, but on average that was different. And so naturally the Muslim conquerors came to adopt the organizational traits, the armor, the weapons that were proper of the local populations. So and you can say that in this sense the Muslim invasion didn't really change much. Actually, it was more the Muslims that got absorbed by the local cultures that the other way around. I mean, the Arabs the other way around. The only effective thing that was Arab at this time was in fact the language and the script. But for the rest, not even ethnically we can talk about Arabs, and we often confuse them fundamentally. But it's important because if you look at material culture, you realize, I don't know, the Arabs that settled into Persia became Persians. The ones who settled into Syria became kind of Syrians. The ones who settled in North Africa became North Africans, etc. And this is not to deny, naturally, the importance that let's say the importance that the Arab conquest had in modifying the local political and social structures, but at the same time, there was a much heavier influence of the Arabs that the Arabs got from these populations than the other way around. Also because, let's be honest, from a military point of view, the Arabs weren't this extremely developed people. They were essentially tribesmen. They were semi-nomad. They were Bedouins fundamentally. So even in terms of military organization, they went, structuring their armies on the base of the places that they were of local administration that already existed and so on. And this was a problem actually in the process, because the Arabs had as ruling class and their original bulk of the army, etc., a very strong, not really a very strong cultural resistance, but they still regarded their tribal units as their clan, their respective clans, etc., as what had to fundamentally control the Dar al-Islam, and that they didn't want to share power with the local elites. But obviously they were forced to do it because there was no other way, basically, to come to control these troops. But naturally the participation to the army effectively had to do with who could bear arms in that world, and therefore with whom could rule. So there were attempts to create a regular Islamic army, right? Especially at least certain units that could be, in this sense, reliable and dependent on a central authority. In the initial tribe, the original tribal clans didn't want this. There were attempts from the same type of Muawiyah, but fundamentally it's until the mid 8th century that the Arabs continued in the caliphate to fight in their traditional unequal-sized tribal units. And there were certain transformations apparently. For instance, since the very first, from 637, it seems that there were certain standardized units that were created, but at a very low level of organic unit. For instance, 10-man units were known as irafas, and each were under a related tribal commander. But you realize that this corresponds just like to a squad. It has not to do with the the upper echelons. And it's interesting that it still, however, has ideally a tribal base, which probably already at this time, by the way, in the 30s of the 7th century, didn't quite correspond necessarily to that, nor was a real uniformity or standardization of these units. It seems, though, that under Caliph Marwan the second, that ruled from 1745 to 745 to 747, there was the introduction of a new system that seems to be of typical classical borrowing. It seems that in particular that this I don't know the source actually, the Arab source specifically, but from the military organization that this presents, this is definitely the Macedonian organization described by Asclepiodotus for the Hellenistic armies of Macedon, because the base is kind of it's kind of more Arab in nature. There was a base unit of 8 archers or 16 spearmen. Archers were fairly important at this time. They had been usually also in the pre-Islamic Arab warfare. So there was this base unit. It could be either 8 archers or 16 spearmen. And this unit was known as Saf al-Makatir. Then there was this other unit named Usbach of 32 men that could be therefore either all archers or all spearmen. So this meant that they were composed by either 4 archer or 2 spearmen Saf al-Makatir units, right? Then from here there is an exponential size of the unit increasing in the hierarchy, so that they are all progressively doubled. There is the 64 men was the Miknab, 128 men the Kurdus, the 256 men Yafal, 512 men Kabkaha, 1024 men Zumrah, 1024 men, then Zumrah, 2048 men Taifa, 4096 men Jash, or Yash, I don't know what it's said, 8192 men Kamis, 16,384 men Al-Askar al-Azam. So this, as you understand, it's very ideal as a hierarchy, and it probably never quite corresponded to any to a real hierarchy. I mean, it doesn't even make sense to kind of have different units that are all kind of double size, progressively in the higher rank. But therefore, this system was never quite used in practice as such. But we have certain units that actually are named more frequently in the sources, and that in fact correspond to kind of more standard unit size. For instance, the smaller unit, the Saf al-Makatir, is comparable to the Byzantine Logachia, while the Yafal, the one with 256 men, to the Arithmos, or infantry bandon. So you realize basically the Muslims here were organizing their units with the same size fundamentally of the Byzantine tagmata, sorry. Because a single tagma at this point in the Byzantine army equated to the with the 200-400 men. That could be known also as the bandon or arithmos, and therefore here you have this Yafal unit that appears frequently. So this is fundamentally a either a company or battalion or regiment size. It depends, but it definitely was this probably was the most common, let's say the most dynamic tactical unit that was out there, like companies normally are. So the units is similar, but even though even this doesn't actually, I think I got wrong before, it doesn't actually appear very often. It seems the only unit that actually appears from the sources is the Kurdus, the 128 men. This is particularly important because that's the real company size unit, and this you can see it throughout all military history. The bulk, the tactical bulk of these armies was constituted by this kind of unit, a company size unit of, in this case, 128 men, that in fact appears frequently in the sources, and that corresponds to the other kind of company size unit that are there. And there is even one source that claims that the Kurdus was first employed at the Battle of Yarmouk in 636, when in fact the Muslims conquered effectively Syria, and this would have happened allegedly in imitation, in fact, of Byzantine units. This is particularly important because here Islam was extremely young. Also, the military organization of these troops was of these Arab armies was relatively simple, so they were kind of learning also from the foes that were meeting now to get more dynamic, to get more functional. I made a video that is called, if I remember correctly, Early Medieval Arab Tactics, which I discuss of how these tactical transformations occurred. In fact, in these very armies we're discussing. So if you're interested in that, in this topic, how they actually fought, go search for that video. It can be interesting. And this applies to infantry. The units we have observed it now were mostly the infantry ones. There are sources recording cavalry units, cavalry organic units. One is going in order of size. So 5 cavalrymen. The unit of 5 cavalrymen was known as Kamsah. 10 to 20 cavalrymen Ashra. 80 cavalrymen Tabli Kanah, and 1,000 cavalry the Alf. It was so called, and they and we have actually other mention of other unit types, even of the infantry ones. For instance, some infantry ones are known as the Katibah. That was something around 500 to 800 men, which is typically a battalion. Fundamentally, it could be easily a set of companies. In this case, of Kurdus, as we have seen before. It's perfectly matching, actually, Kurdus or Yafal. By the way, consider that if the numbers we have listed before about the several units are always to be intended as ideal, because eventually units get always worn out during campaigns, so they're always under strength. So these numbers kind of add up, and they're plausible. And another unit, pretty large one, was the Failak of 5,000 men, which at this point is clearly either kind of like a brigade or a division, actually. And so these are big units that were used definitely at kind of provincial organization, even regional level of military organization. To in big blocks were sent from one region to another in the big expeditions, let's say. But naturally, the average armies would be something smaller. For the majority of military operations, I think we're going to require more than a pair of companies or a battalion, something like that. So if you look at these units, they are even plausibly compatible with a decimal organization that is witnessed also by some other sources, and was seemingly employed especially under the Abbasid Caliphate, with units of several, like 10, 50, 100, and 1,000, and that were commanded also by certain specific officers, like the Arif for 10, the Khalifa for 50, the Qaid for 100, and the Amir for 1,000. That the Amir is in the Islamic world fundamentally strictly the military commander, like the officer, like the guy who kind of makes war as a profession, whereas the Caliph is fundamentally the political, the religious and political, and in the sense also military guide overall, and the Malik is the king instead. That is kind of a negative in the Arab language, Malik is kind of a negative thing, because theoretically it represents kind of very mundane powers that were forgetful of the Sharia and all this stuff, whereas instead in Christianity the Rex is a title attributed in fact also to Christ. So there's a completely different political culture relation with political authority, etc. Interestingly enough, with the development of this military organization, of this ordered military organization, you can see the appearance, especially under the Abbasid period. So this moment where, in fact, a greater central organization and permanent character attached to the armies is developed. You can find certain specialized units that are attached to specialized troops attached to units, especially of archer units, that are the so-called Nafatun. So the Nafatun were literally Nafta troops. They were handling, in fact, incendiary weapons. You know that the Mesopotamian region is famous for oil, for petroleum, and the Abbasids had their center power exactly there. So they used these flammable weapons like grenades, explosive grenades, incendiary grenades, the Arabs were now acquainted, partly also having seized all the Byzantine libraries of Syria and of Egypt. Were acquainted with all the mysteries of the various of the various formulas and mixtures of chemicals that could create incendiary explosive weapons and stuff like that. So these were particularly important in sieges, and that's why also they were probably attached to larger archer units, and they functioned as a bit as a complement, like even as military engineers, actually, not just as fire throwers or stuff like that. And what is fascinating is that the Muslims at this time had some of the most advanced scientific knowledge in the world, and these Nafatun were wearing asbestos textile clothes that are in fact the same textile garments that are used today in part for protective jackets for firefighters and stuff like that, because they are in fact used as they're fireproof, they're fire resistant, not flammable, etc. So they were definitely to handle even these explosives and fire that it could backfire, and naturally they were engaged probably with against enemies that knew the same craft. Take the Byzantines, but also other Muslims. So this is kind of obvious. And interestingly enough, the Nafatun were also in charge of the artillery at this time. That is mangonels, catapults, and that also launched these pods of incendiaries that existed also in the form of grenades. So this is particularly important. Talking about the artillery, we may make a separated chapter, but it's still important. The Arabs actually learned pretty soon to use artillery, because both the Byzantines and the Sassanids made extensive use of that. So the Arabs got immediately acquainted to that. They immediately got the personnel, the know-how, the resources to build siege machinery, and this could even be permanently stored, dismounted in two pieces in certain warehouses and brought out there in campaign on camelbacks, etc. And this is typical, especially the beams for the trebuchets or the mangonel were the big things that were created to remain. Then the rest of the structure could even be built in loco, but the Muslim world at this point was very much interconnected, so there was a lot of trade and material and so accessing these resources was not difficult at all. For instance, the Fatimids, even in Egypt, that is an area where renownedly there is a few wood since antiquity, so that was a problem for being siege artillery. Seemingly made extensive use of artillery as well, so this throwing engines, so whatever you want to call them. And however, at this time, especially in the early period, trebuchets are something that kind of developed a bit later, but initially there were these smaller engines known as aradah, which actually means just like onaga in Latin, a wild donkey, because this was the name that was done to given to this small machinery with torsion engines that basically, when they were unblocked, they kicked violently against this beam that was put in front of the arm, that was the throwing arm, and that therefore looked like a donkey kicking, that where the name comes from. It's interesting to look at these etymologies and seeing that both in Arab and in Latin they were kind of the same, not transliterated, but as a matter of fact the same in the respective language etymologically. So it's fascinating. although you can see even transliterations. For instance, the larger engines were known as manganique, and in Byzantine there was the word manganica, but unlike these ones, the Arab manganiques were actually like more like trebuchets, and not like the normal kind of torsion catapult that was partly still used at this time. Although the most average the average stone thrower this time was what you find in Latin known as petraria, and in Greek like petrobolos and stuff like that, that are recorded in the Arab armies since the siege of Constantinople of 665, that were nicknamed either the Mother of the Scalp or the Long-Haired, because basically they were certain very simple built siege engines that you had to active with your muscular force, like a lot of people that are pulling this set of ropes that are attached to a beam that is in turn attached to the arm, the throwing arm of the engine, that were pulled all together and they were used to be launched. And this is often regarded as a kind of regression from the sophisticated torsion engines of the ancient world, but actually at the time was kind of the most effective thing you could use, and they were extensively used also by the Byzantines and so on. However, there were torsion engines in Muslims' armies at this time, like the ballistae, so like these big large crossbows that could throw things. So yeah, it was very varied, and definitely the Islamic armies at this point, especially one of the largest powers, like I don't know, Abbasid, Mesopotamia, or Fatimid Egypt, or Umayyad Spain, or any other kind of decent power at the time used. So yeah, and it's interesting that in the military organization of these armies there is this distinction already, that of selected bodies of kind of specialists of military engineers that deal both with artillery, with explosive, with incendiary stuff, etc. So it's kind of fascinating. And from a strictly administrative point of view, the Byzantine influence on the Islamic armies is kind of more evident, because the Arabs came to replicate what were the themata districts of the Roman regions that they came to conquer. In Arab, these were called as Yund, which in Arab means like army. So it's very it's very effective, because it's like a bit the themata in the Byzantine world. It's this association of the administrative district that also has some civil function, that however is all one with the military one as well, which was typical of the Byzantine Empire this time, and also of the Muslim regions, and especially in this area bordering the Byzantine Empire, where massive warfare, large-scale warfare was seen. In fact, the earliest Yuns were 4, and they were exactly in Syria and Palestine, because they were the ones of Homs, of Damascus, the one of Jordan, and the one of Palestine. So these were effectively the pre-conquest Byzantine Syrian provinces, and the Arabs simply came to adopt what the Byzantine administration was already there, standing at the moment of their arrival. So, which is pretty normal to do, pretty clever to do, by the way. And bear in mind that this has nothing to do like saying, oh, they copied all from the Byzantines because there were a bunch of primitives. No, it doesn't work like that, because if they had been a bunch of primitives, they wouldn't made it collapse. Instead, they were perfectly capable of absorbing it and making it function, which means that they were at that point already as receptive and as advanced. This is very important, because you realize many times in history that populations that came out relatively recently from a tribal context where their societies were relatively primitive, etc., have actually much less cultural resistance than more developed structured civilizations, and they're capable, in fact, of absorbing the very best from all around. And this is, in a nutshell, the story of some of the most effective empires out there. In fact, like the Roman one, like the Islamic, like the Caliphate, like the Mongol Empire, they were always kind of like that. So what is interesting also in here is that these yuns were occupied as districts by the various Arab clans that led the conquest. So basically the tribesmen settling there, like the military class initially speaking. And therefore they seized fundamentally these lands for their own, becoming responsible for the defense of their own district. And in this specific area of the Near East, they made up fundamentally the Syrian frontier with the Byzantine Empire. So the area where, in fact, the Muslims also were more worried. The Muslims were more worried about, because they were, in fact, the Byzantines came at a certain point to strike back, and therefore that became a highly militarized frontier where the major offensives from kind of the greatest, power that they were bordering with, that could come from. And there was the Arabs used fortified camps. Like in this period of the early Middle Ages, you realize that conquerors that arrive, etc., tend to form this, just like anyone, this initial fortified positions, chiefly occupying the fortresses that exist already, but also building kind of their own camps. The Arab ones were they were relatively simple, actually. Like most of camps were built at that time, they were made up by a circular earthwork with 4 gates, and within which the tents or other small buildings were kind of erected. So a normal camp. And the Syrian yuns were particularly important because they came to be the first nucleus of the early Arab armies, because basically they were regions this was a region that was already organized for a military presence, and that could be effective, especially in defense, etc. These were the regions that, in fact, the Byzantines had organized during the wars against the Sassanids on that frontier for centuries. So they were already kind of well fit for providing troops, etc. And this is interesting because the Arab armies at this point were kind of permanent, because every man was obliged to serve for 1 year in every 4 years. So this means that it's been estimated, at least, that this for instance, the Yund of Kufa, that was not in Syria, is actually in South Iraq, but this thing of the Yund was exported soon also in the rest of the Caliphate, could maintain 10,000 men in the field at all times. Naturally, this is a bit ideal, because these weren't really like professional troops, so they presumably, were eligible for service for 1 year, but it's not that they actually stayed in service for like one consecutive year. They were just eligible to be called up to arms, and they were organized in this way. So also when you read these things, always be aware that these armies, especially when you start talking about in the measure of tens of thousands, uh, only a small part of them was made up by professional soldiers that were regularly equipped, kind of more or less a permanent standing force, and the rest were just levies that were called. And by the way, this speaks only for those who had to be combat ready for 1 year in case of necessity, but in the most desperate situations, naturally, the levies could be drawn more extensively. And this is a problem, by the way, because it's difficult at this time to put together an army of tens of thousands, and it's kind of you have to have much more than one unit, let's say, to achieve it effectively, or to have actually a real combat force, because you can also feed lots of peasants to join the army, but they're not gonna be of much of use, and they're gonna be extremely costly anyway for logistics as well. And so you would prefer kind of smaller armies, but kind of more effective ones. However, we are told that in 741, the units of Homs, the four Syrian units could field the 6,000 cavalry and infantry each. And this is a plausible number. Actually, it's also interesting that it mixes cavalry and infantry, because at the time probably they were still not clearly distinguished, and we will probably never know more than much about this. And eventually, in the early 80s of the 7th century, Caliph Yazid I added other two units, the one of King Nasrin, that is in Syria as well, and the one of Egypt, that could field 3,000 cavalry and infantry each. So here you see how progressively the unit system is expanded to the rest of the caliphal domains, and therefore, if you put all these units together, you realize that between the 7th and 8th centuries, the caliphate could field a substantial number of troops comprehended between 10 to 40,000. And it's not a few, and it's also realistic, because if you think about all kind of the area, that's these were, by the way, some of the wealthiest areas of the world at the time, so it's kind of also plausible in general. There was also a military bureaucracy was developing in order to cope with all the organizational logistical problems. They were known as divans. Divans is the kind of the bureau in many ways, and this was particularly important also because troops had to be paid, and hopefully regularly. The initially pay arrived at distance of like 1 or 2 months, given that they had to be theoretically regular. But naturally, we know very few about this, and things varied enormously from place to place. It seems that forces like the Ghulams, that we will see later, were paid kind of more regularly, more frequently at least, because they were more valuable, and there was also a problem of these were kind of slave troops that eventually were growing into consistent power, also having political influence, etc. So that is normal. While the militias, the free troops, etc., could be paid even less regularly, which also shows to you how actually the slave troops were way more effective than the Muslim freemen. um, booty definitely remained as a consistent part of the to make up for consistent part of the pay in each campaign, and we can assume that certain troops actually didn't have any regular stipend, but they joined simply because they expected to make to loot, to grow richer like that. So occasionally, and this was pretty normal at the time, also because warfare regularly had this kind of nature in itself at the time. Caliphs naturally had, since the beginning, a corps of bodyguards, and especially, and we don't know excessively much about this, but the guard units became naturally they became increasingly important in many ways. Especially under the Abbasids, it seems that the Khwarezmians made up the Caliphal Guard, and they came to become they became fundamentally an army on their own. It seems that by 779 they totaled as many as 30,000 men. This happened because, as you can see in many other empires, there are many parallelisms that can be traced. Now, the local population, local militias were growing kind of weaker, poorer, and so there was definitely a crisis of recruitment, progressive, stratification of society, for which the average commoner was not much good for war. So the guard units were a bit something between a regular army and a mercenary one, because the guard unit naturally was expected to be extremely fiercely loyal, and they had to, at least initially, be somewhat neutral to the political problems. But at this time, it's where the Ghulams also start entering to the army. So these are foreigners that also have other goals. They have perspectives of career. So in part they're loyal, in part they are disloyal. It's a bit like the Praetorians, if you want. This happens many times in history. Some caliphal guards actually were even of different religion. The Omayyads in Spain had Christian elite troops that fought for them. As much like in the West, there were think about Frederick II, who had Muslim bodyguard, etc. So it was perfectly normal. Religion, in this sense, was a useful discriminant, because it kind of usually it was not much because of religion in itself, but it was because these people came from different worlds, like from the other side, where they were extraneous to the local conflicts, also that were religiously rooted, at least formally. So this could be a way. And the bodyguards, the guard units, came to actually replace the Yuns as the army nucleus at this point. So they were born actually as just an elite, and then they take over the regular army. It's kind of a constant many times in history. And I was talking to you about the Ghulams. So these were the kind of mercenary slave troops. It's kind of difficult to define them, because sometimes Western historiography has looked upon these troops like saying, this is just a barbaric thing. They were just slaves. The Ghulams, like the Mamluks eventually, were it's difficult to talk about actual slavery, because definitely there was that, especially at the beginning, where these troops were literally raided from other places. Especially the Caucasus was traditionally one area of regular among Christian population, by the way, to hire. But later these were growing to be rewarded, to have a kind of power on their own. Even their masters had some duties towards them, as much as obviously they had to be loyal, faithful to their masters. So it was actually a very reciprocal relation. It wasn't just slaves obeying to their masters. They also, because as we've seen, they were highly prized. They came to become to be paid even more than the regular army, and this means that they were extremely useful and effective, and they had a political influence that they could also use to take over by themselves. We will see with the Tulunids, for instance, in Egypt, that was a Ghulam dynasty that rose to power pretty early in time, actually at the end of the 9th century, if I'm not wrong. So these the Ghulams came to basically substitute, even at a provincial level, the local regiments, and they also becoming actually the same commanders of the same Ghulam units. So they even substituted free commanders and became effectively this kind of slave class that was depending on the local, leader at various levels, actually, because this could happen with the caliph as much as that was the universal power, as much as the local dynasts that were ruling on behalf of the caliph, in the name of the caliph. So it seems that it's difficult to tell when actually the Ghulams were first introduced, because it's actually difficult to. Slavery was all around, both in pre-Islamic and post-Islamic. I don't know, pre-Islamic and Islamic times, let's say better, and therefore, when is that these start to be used? Would be more interesting is to track the pools, let's say the ethnic pools where these troops were actually drawn from, because there were at all times kind of foreign troops that were bought literally even as slaves, even in pre-Islamic Arabia. But it seems that what we call as defined as Ghulams, and those who eventually took over the power into the Abbasid Caliphate, etc., started appearing albeit on a small scale, since the very beginning of the 9th century. And there is, however, this general traditional introduction that has allegedly taken place for the first time under the Caliph al-Mutasim that ruled between 833 to 842, who basically bought 3,000 Turkish slave soldiers. This is important, talking about the Turks, because you know that the Turks were these populations dwelling into Central Asia in the steppes, and who were actually known already by the Romans, the Sassanids. It's kind of difficult to speak about ethnicities, especially in that context, because this, when we talk about Turks, it was mostly about which kind of ethnic core they belong to, politically speaking, or better, with the political core they belonged ethnically. It's kind of, we can switch the thing, because in the steppes there was a great fluidity in the agglomeration of these groups. So when we talk about Turks, we're not actually talking about genetic Turks, which definitely came from this Ugrophinnic stock of the Eurasian steppes, etc. But there were many tribesmen of Indo-European descent, for instance, that were part of these groups, as much as Turkish elements that were part of the Indo-European peoples of Eurasia, etc. So you could find kind of blonde and blue-eyed Turks among these ones at this time. So it was very fluid. But what is important in here is that the Abbasid Empire, the Abbasid Caliphate, is in many ways like the Sassanid Empire. At the outskirts of this, it's a sedentary power, and it's at the outskirts of the steppes as well. So it has this complicated relation, to say at least, with the steppes that are actually a source of threat, because there are these nomadic populations that can swarm within the borders and raid, etc. But that however can still be very profitable for this this state to hire as mercenaries, as fresh energy to be spent. Also because these were rather primitive in groups of people that even the steppes was quite diverse. It's not that the steppe was this total wasteland with just ferocious raiders around and around. There were areas of the steppes that were actually pretty advanced. This area at the outskirts of the same at the frontier of the same Muslim world that would be Khorasan and Transoxiana, etc. That were areas that at the time were actually the existence of some of the largest cities in the world. I think the largest city in the world at the time was the city of Merv. It is somewhere, I think, in today's Turkmenistan. It was eventually destroyed by the Mongols in the 13th century. But those were areas where sedentaries and nomads had always coexisted, and therefore there were also these intermediaries. And when we talk about slaves, troops, we have to think, and also definitely as there was a flourishing market of slaves that weren't really actually bought, they weren't actually conquered in military expeditions, which definitely could happen, where most often were actually bought from the same tribal units that fought one against the other. And it's always been the case like that. I mean, every kind of the majority of the major responsible for slavery are definitely those who capture slaves and then eventually sell them to other people, just buy them that are already slaves. And this was the case, in fact, in this pretty based empire that could draw from several ethnic pools, as we will also see now when coming to buy mercenaries. Naturally, the Turks were particularly effective because they had they had this military traditions of the from which they dominated in the steppes, the hit and run tactics with horse archers, etc. So these were quite efficient troops, mounted troops most of the times, and therefore they were quite easy to handle, quite effective, quite tempered and trained, etc. So part of them also sanitarized. And what is interesting, and is naturally the Ghulams start to take over. Just think about the Seljuks that effectively at one point they kidnap with the excuse of protection the same Abbasid Caliph, and they come to rule on this base area that stretched from Anatolia to Afghanistan. And this got even in turn, just like the Arabs had done at the beginning, in turn culturally influenced by the local traditions. Like the Seljuk Turks were heavily Persified, for instance. So Persia here, this continuous pool of civilization emanating with fallout all around. This is particularly important. Persia was an incredibly balance point for all the power in the Middle East, and it continues to be, in fact, because of its natural strategical location across these regions, the very diverse regions of the world between India and Europe and the steppes and the Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf. So it's very very influential place that was also very important to control, and also very difficult to control. Excuse me, I drink a little bit before I go on. So under the Caliphate of Al-Mamun, who instead ruled on it was the 7th Abbasid Caliph, one of the most important figures of the Middle Ages. He ruled the Islamic Ummah from 813 to 833. He seemingly employed 10,000 Turks, as well as perhaps 30,000 Negroes in his army. Now, naturally, these numbers are pretty large. I mean, I don't think that, for instance, actually 30,000 black Africans could be drawn like in that mass, because even 30,000 people, well, it depends on how they were settled. Now I don't know the details of this, but it's still meaningful because it tells you, however, the importance of these external elements. You can't disbelieve the tens of thousands that are always kind of difficult and complicated to manage, even just in a single army logistically, etc. But it still tells you how, important these foreign troops were into the caliphate, and how far they could range. Because now we will see also from which kind of ethnicities these troops actually came. The caliphate reached, in this sense, up to Southeast Africa with the Bantus. So just reflect on the sheer dimension. Even from a Western perspective, these guys actually went far beyond. They went up to the Far East, to South Africa, something that that others hadn't quite done in the same way. And exporting Islam in the process, by the way. So as far as black soldiers, we know that they were used also, in fact, since this 9th century. But we know that black Negro troops, slave soldiers, were used very much before. In fact, we have evidence for the Battle of Uhud in 625, so when Muhammad was still alive. The participation of a Negro slave soldier on that occasion. The Battle of Uhud is important because it brought to the basically it was a defeat of the Muslims at the time, and at the hand of the Meccans, as a matter of fact. So this was particularly important because also the Prophet Muhammad participated to it. It's kind of all the mythology naturally surrounding these events, because these are very far back in time, so also we don't really know. But even on this occasion, we have a black soldier participating to the battle. Naturally, Arabia is not very far from Africa, so there is actually nothing strange about it. Even the same Sasanid empire had stretched its power over the African Horn. They imported definitely black slaves from Africa, and so this was perfectly normal. But just for saying how these slaves were used in the army since actually the very beginning of Islam in this case, and there is the proof. We actually know that by 638, so also extremely early, 1,000 black slaves took part into a battle. And there are many other ethnicities. For instance, there are Slavic and Berber slave troops mentioned in the service of Umayyad caliphs occasionally. So even though the Ghulams were principally Turkish, there were many other ethnicities. There were the Berbers, the Zanji, there would be Bantus from southeastern Africa. Do you realize what that means? There were, people who went... well, this was a slave export, but the slave export entails also, people actually traveling through all the way from South Africa to places like Iraq, etc. So this tells you how interconnected was that world. We have mention of Nubians, of Kurds, that definitely also were kind of very closer at that point, naturally, in Mesopotamia. The Dailamis, the Slavs. There were lots of Slavs since the early times of Islam, serving, used into not just even as slaves, actually. Then Khazars. We actually even have evidence of Byzantines, of Georgians, Armenians, and even Rus. Even though it's believed that at this point the Rus were bands of Vikings that were actually, seeking for employment into the caliphate as free mercenaries, which is also perfectly fine. As we've said before, there were the Mawali that were all this kind of non-Muslims that joined the army as freemen in a way or in another, or at least maybe as subjects but still not slaves. That is very meaningful. So we know that the Rus traveled far and wide into the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea. They arrived to these areas that were, the Muslim travelers, even up to Scandinavia. So there were all, contacts of all sort at this point. And we know that naturally this thing of slavery also took other paths. Like some of the slaves were, especially the most intelligent ones, were selected, were castrated to become actually bureaucrats, as in the administration, etc. This was done because the eunuch was, in this sense, not physically fit to rule, because only someone with not make me be too graphic, but someone with certain capability, even physical qualities, has the right to rule. This existed in Islam as well as in any other place at this time, in Christianity, etc. So they couldn't usurp the throne. This was particularly important. Well, the majority of slaves were definitely instead trained as there was a selection also in there. Kind of the most physically fit will train to be soldiers, and the white slaves at this point were already called Mamluks, I believe. So it's a pretty ancient term that eventually kind of became to define the successors of the Ayyubids specifically. But the term Mamluk, the ruling dynasty of Egypt and Syria in the low Middle Ages, but the term was already there before, and there was, by the way, a lot of enmity between all these various ethnic groups of Ghulams. This happened for many reasons. First of all, because naturally there was a sort of, affinity deriving from common origins that could in this sense, create a sort of identitary cohesion. Even though we can imagine that the ethnic mix was still pretty much alive in these groups, because sometimes we say, okay, these are, I don't know, the Turkish Ghulams, but actually you can find people from many other ethnicities in there. So sometimes the ethnicity was also kind of a flag, but for the unit, but it could vary really. But it's not difficult to understand that depending on where you were being drawn from originally, where you were stationed, you would have different feelings, fundamentally different affinities with different groups. By the way, consider that the groups of Ghulams were actually recruited, now we will see it, from different places at once, from different rulers, and after the death of their rulers, if they didn't get disbanded, were bought by other rulers. So there wasn't just a uniform mixing rule in here, overruled, that brought all these foreigners together and blended them in. So it's obvious that certain powers were closer to Caucasus would recruit preferably, I don't know, Georgians, Armenians, and stuff like that. Other powers like Egypt that were close to Nubia would recruit blacks, and this is kind of obvious. Like who was in Persia was closer to the Turks, etc. So it's perfectly normal. So these enmities would form also because of this competition that naturally could equate to also to serve different flags that made use of different ethnicities. So basically Turks, Berbers, Nubians, Slavs didn't like each other at all, and were put together. They usually also led to to unrest. They kind of fought against each other, killed each other, and all this stuff. So, tip of the day: keep the Ghulams separated on the basis of their ethnicity, even though it wasn't actually even like this. And however, the Ghulam phenomenon is particularly important because it comes to define basically all the most important dynamics in the Islamic military at this time, because the Ghulams vastly expanded in numbers, relatively progressively, but like in massive numbers at the end of the day. So there was no, and it was kind of easier because, as we have seen, the local populations now were not particularly engaged in warfare anymore. Either they couldn't, either they were too poor, or they didn't want to serve in the military. This happens all the time, especially when there is a gentrification. This can have done, this might have happened within the same Arab elite of the early days that now had kind of settled down and lost its original military aptness, let's say. So it was easier just to, at this point also there is a kind of economical growth, so money flows into the caliphate, in the Arabs that are at the center of intercontinental traffics, etc. So they have a lot of money to spend, and they can spend them to buy these mercenaries. We have some measures, like 70,000 slaves bought all at once in, I don't know, in the 10th century from Arab sources, but naturally that can be exaggerated. Nevertheless, such high numbers still reflect the actual influence that such troops had in this system. And basically the military power in the Islamic world at this time was based on how many Ghulams you could buy. So naturally, in other words, as always, how much money you have, which is always the the fundamental discriminant of every conflict in many ways. But there is a further evolution also in the conditions of employment, because initially these were troops that either were drawn from kidnapped, or bought, or conquered, etc. But they also start and therefore spent immediately. But also these troops eventually start to gentrify, start to take root into the Islamic world, and then this happens through the granting of land. That naturally at a certain point, especially at this one, we have seen there was a lot of currency around, but still the land was the base of the economy. As always, in pre-industrial times. So these slaves that evidently were not really, complete slaves, that were given land individually. So here the slavery has to be understood as something, as a sort of patronage, more than actual slavery in the worst sense of the word as we imagine it. And this land was known as ikta'at, and was meant naturally to pay them, to reward them. And this mostly happened in the Eastern Emirates, because a bit of certain cultural traits. We've seen before how the regions of Persia, also the eastern areas, further eastern areas, were characterized a bit like a sort of feudalism, or proto-feudalism as you want to call it. So rewarding with land at that point was kind of the average in that world, and there were usually also the least urbanized areas were also the most highly militarized. So this entailed still having land also for keeping yourself further, not just getting land, I don't know, in a peaceful place into the center of Mesopotamia, where everything is, more or less civil and urbanized, but also having land, a bit like it was happening actually in continental Europe, like, having the vassalic beneficiary system. I'd give you land as a king, in this case the caliph in the east, and you keep fighting for me with that land. So it is perfectly understandable. This started happening, in fact, mostly in the east. It's the case of areas like it seemingly was firstly introduced by the Buyids in the 10th century. Now the Buyids were a Shia dynasty that ruled, in fact, on Persia and partly also on Iraq between the 10th and the 11th century. All these dynasties that we also will see, the Ghaznavids, the not extremely famous, but actually they had their time. They were quite powerful at the day, and they were rising and falling actually through military action. So also this introduction of grants of land for these slave troops is kind of meaningful. And however, let's remember that many Ghulam units actually weren't settled, but they remained still permanently in service under someone, because that also was a business. This tells you that basically war was out there pretty frequently, pretty endemically, so there was always a place where there was a rich and powerful dynasty who could hire mercenaries who can make a living out of it. So very often what happened is that slave troops were hired, and if there was no one to hire them anymore, they were disbanded. But also sometimes they could be hired. They could be hired by someone else. This is important because there was a kind of a personal bond between in fact, the master and the slave. It was a matter of faithfulness. Think about in the Turkish world, even this Persian slash or Turkish, Persified Turkish world, etc. The idea of vassalage, of loyalty, of being under an overlord and being faithful to him was actually a thing, even ethically speaking. These were worlds that either in the steppes or in feudal Persia were had at the core of their ethics the loyalty to the military leader, etc. So it was a way of living in many ways. So it was a personal bondage, and this personal bondage meant that you weren't doing it really for you were kind of fighting for yourself in some ways, but you were also doing with the idea of being still part of a hierarchy of some kind. And this was particularly evident for slaves that in fact were not free, and therefore could also hope for freedom or to get a better status through what was possible to them only in order to achieve this, at least quickly, and using what they knew how to do best. It was war, fundamentally. It was fighting, being hired by someone and to make a living out of it. They and there is to say that unlike the Western feudalism that eventually kind of immediately degenerated in something hereditary, this in the Muslim world, the land that was granted to the slaves was just usually temporary. So it often these properties came back to the original owner. This is particularly important because it also explains to you, this is typical especially of the Near East, right? In the Middle East there are more kind of, there is a higher degree of dynastization, but it happened also in the West in some ways. I mean in the Near East, obviously, West from a Middle Eastern perspective. And the personal tie with the owner was also particularly evident from the name of the Ghulams regiments that were named after their commanders slash owners. For instance, I don't know if Al-Nasir owned a regiment was known as Nasiriyya, right? So that they owned that like a sort of patronymic that is typical also of the clientels, of the relations between the master and the serf, etc. And however, some Ghulam units were named actually after the ethnicity of origin. For instance, Sudanese Ghulams could be were sometimes called like Sudanese Ghulams units could be known as Sudaniya. Or there were also troops coming from the Byzantine Empire, like, yeah, there were literally troops. There were either slaves of war or even people who simply went there. They went in the east that came from the Byzantine Empire that fought in units known as Rumiyya. So from the Rum, that was the name of Rome, fundamentally how the Muslims called the Roman Empire. It would be also, in fact, interesting to deepen on the presence of freemen within the Ghulam troops, because that was effectively a business that was open to anyone. At the end of the day, obviously, you don't have necessarily to be a slave to have a reason to go fight out there in some way. So mercenarism was extremely varied, kind of constantly present everywhere, etc. And pretty soon, as we were saying before, the Caliph guards started to be composed by Ghulams. This could literally happen by taking certain detachments of troops from the same Ghulam regiments, because naturally, if these were the guys who knew how to fight best, that's what you want even in your bodyguard. Plus, they're foreigners, so they kind of fight for you because you pay them, so essentially, so they don't have any other reason for it. They don't, hopefully at least, they don't know about the local intrigues, at least if they are pretty new, they just came from wherever they were hired. They don't know the Muslim world that much. The problems actually started happening later when they also got involved the local political affairs, and they started, in fact, taking over the caliphal power, like with the Seljuk Turks. There were also freed slaves. Sometimes the caliph's personal bodyguard was made by these troops that were called al-Ghilman al-Kassa, and the Ghulams were used also in the Fatimid bodyguard of Caliph al-Mustansir, that by the mid-11th century had 1,000 cavalry and infantry. It was a kind of a recurrent number in here. It's important that they're also mixed in tactical functions, like in different arms. So this tells you that these weren't just, they were actually armies on their own. They were complete armies on their own with their tactical specializations within them, and they could be used as a private army effectively, because that was not just a bodyguard. Yeah, the function to defend the caliph in that case, but they fought effectively as an army on their own. And this is kind of typical of the Muslim world. This point, in many ways, the rise of the Ghulams is particularly important in Muslim history. Also, to look at the political and military, events that took place in here. So what else can we say now? This practice of using slave troops naturally spread also among the lower ranks, so that they weren't just the caliphs like ruling this. The Muslim world went politically fragmented, as we were saying at the beginning of the video. So all the various amirs, that is these lords fundamentally, that made up the Muslim world, just like lords made up the Christian world at this time, started using their own slave troops, and often in large numbers, and they and this is typical of, for instance, think about the Tulunid armies. The Tulunid dynasty was this army taking over Egypt on its own, that was founded by Ahmad ibn Tulun, who was an ex-Ghulam himself, and he is thought to have had, he was ruling over Egypt. He had like something like 24,000 Turks and 40,000 Nubians in his army. and we're at the end of the 9th century. And sometimes the Tulunid army is recorded as 100,000. Naturally, these numbers, as always, are very, very large. I don't think that Egypt, as powerful as it effectively was at the time, could field more than 30,000 troops at the largest. Nevertheless, this presence is very meaningful. You have, in fact, Turkish and Nubian slaves that make up this army. So you see a very international, say, multi-ethnical army compost, let's say, which is typical of that reality of the even the commercial dynamism of the Islamic world, accessing these pools of recruitment from slavery, etc. And they the Ghulams at this point are so widespread that they start, in fact, making politics on their own. We've seen it with the Tulunids that rise to power in Egypt, albeit for a few decades, but they still make it. But they start participating to the local political affairs. So these Ghulam regiments become pretty dangerous in many ways, and they were, in fact, sometimes to be taken out in turn because they could become too difficult. For instance, in 930, the Masifia regiment was actually wiped out exactly because of this. So you want to get rid of these guys when they become too dangerous for your own rule. And this is a kind of paradox because the Ghulam system had been developed exactly in origin, exactly in order to counter the disloyalty to the constituted authority in the Muslim world. With all the religious division, the political secessions, etc. And the Ghulams were chosen because they had to be external, sometimes not even Muslims. At this point, instead, they start entering effectively to be part of the Muslim world as a constitutive part, and they start, in fact, taking over the local power, and to become, in fact, kind of the same part of it in many ways. And at this point, the system, however, didn't end for one specific reason. That is that it was not like the steppes always and other regions around the Islamic world always provided these troops. There was always the opportunity to seize slaves from foreign lands that were stranger to the local disputes. So even if these Ghulams became dangerous, sometimes the best way to get rid of them was with other Ghulams. As far as the 13th century, you even have Kipchak Turks from the far steppes that are employed, and it's the same Bayriya Ghulam regiment that eventually established the Mamluk state, overthrowing the Ayyubids. So this was the general rule at this point, and it was naturally intertwined with many other problems that were typical of the Muslim world at this point, that actually are characteristics of the same, and that even, however, brought to the rise of more consistent powers, like, in fact, take the Mamluks and their power, and this system was to be surpassed fundamentally by other models. For instance, the Ottomans at the end of the medieval period will fundamentally put an end to this, or better, they didn't actually, because they created the Janissary Corps that, however, was meant still to be a permanent body, which was very different from what the Ghulams were originally, because the Ghulams were not permanent. So the Janissaries were recruited in the same ways, we can't say of the Ghulams. Actually, with the Devshirmen, it was something that in origin could have, was this seizing of younger foreigners to kidnapping them and training to teaching Islam to them and training them as soldiers, etc. But at least at that point was the idea of creating a kind of a permanent state with a permanent army that was fiercely loyal to the Sultan, and those that system, however, maybe it's not really useful to make this example because it's exactly what happened also in the period we're commenting now. But let's say that these troops also equated a little bit like the feudal lords in Christian Europe. And in Christian Europe we find the same. It's not that feudality disappears over time, but over time, towards the late Middle Ages, the kingdoms start, slowly being built. So in the Islamic world, so with the Roman armored forces and so on. So in the Islamic world starts happening in some occasions kind of the same thing. There is also all the problem of the Ghaznavids that were also this other component of the Islamic armies that were this military, these holy warriors that in the Islamic world everything that is a fighter is, if it is Muslim, it's holy in some way because they're doing it for their own faith. But these were also kind of bands of irregulars that had characterized a little bit the Islamic world generally. And towards the end of the Middle Ages, these main powers start to get rid of them to create something more permanent. Sometimes, in fact, it started like just with Janissaries, with similar practices to one of with which the Ghulam slave troops were actually created. But still, they were increasingly framed into a statal control. That is something that effectively failed to be achieved in by the Abbasids back in the day, that had lost their power effectively at the hands of their Turkish slaves. Interestingly enough, however, as we were saying before, there were also foreign troops. For instance, regions of the Maghreb and the Mashrek, such as, in fact, kept providing Bedouins, like the Arabs broke out from Arabia. All of a sudden they started to sedentarize, but there were still Arabs in Arabia, and this kept being used as kind of free mercenaries. The same for the North African Bedouins. And they weren't paid much. Actually, they never rose to the fortunes of the Ghulams. They were actually also smaller in numbers and worse paid, and also less reliable on the battlefield than the same Ghulams. So this is kind of important. And that's also why the Ghulams effectively, in spite of all the, on the long run of the systemic problem that they created, were still effective troops that were, effectively loyal. We should get rid of this 19th century stereotype of the mercenaries, just like a son of a bitch that abandons you in the just for, but it's the most unreliable unit that it ever exists. No. The mercenaries throughout all history have been some of the most reliable forces ever existed, and a conscripted militiaman is not a better option than a grizzled veteran that fights for money. Actually, also because if the guy risks his life for money, it's because he probably thinks that you have the things are going well for you, so he doesn't get employed by people who he thinks he's gonna die for. Fundamentally, he still hopes to live on. There were these other elements of the Ghaznavids that we have seen that are also fairly the Islamic world has certain concepts that are by the way, Islamic history is immense, so things changed. They're kind of difficult to define. The Ghaznavids were individuals that fundamentally participated to military expeditions or raids, and they they start appearing into the sources, Muslim sources, even from the time they say Muhammad. There were Ghazis, in fact, participating with Muhammad military expeditions, and eventually it became a kind of a holy title in this sense. So especially these Turkish military leaders that took over what was the Arab world, or the Arab-speaking world in the Near East, started defining themselves as Ghazis, because at that point it was a kind of an honorific title, and kind of a a guarantee of authority, of military effectiveness, etc. Islam has in itself this concept of the of the conquest, of the fort, of the idea, also partially of the subjugation, because the same term Islam means something like this. I mean, you should be kind of subjugated by God. So the idea is you have to be fanatically loyal in many ways, and this in fact came to define, to characterize partly the same Islamic military organization with these titles, with the employment of this of Ghulams, etc. The Ghazis, however, in the time we are discussing now, were kind of volunteers. There was a lot of kind of hypocrisy surrounded the thing, because these were effectively just raiders that participated for loot, etc. But there was still an idea that back in the day this had been the activity that the first guys of the guys of the first hour with Muhammad had done in the same way. So the Ghazi was praised for his willingness to fight, to extend the rule of Islam and all this stuff. So they were considered to be rewarded in this holy enterprise. And you find Ghazis literally everywhere. Usually Ghazis belonged mostly to this frontier areas where also the political power is weaker, and therefore there are these local bands of mercenaries, of warriors are kind of more active, more powerful in the political balance. But you can find them literally everywhere, even as pirates, for instance, also by sea. And in fact, the same Arabs, by the way, regarded them by the 10th century fundamentally as bandits, right, or corsairs at least, rather than actual defenders of the faith. Okay, so this was an important element that could be more or less extended in name to various types of troops. Naturally, like in most of the Middle Ages, there were the troops, the armies of these Islamic powers were made up by local levies, more simply. So those were conscripts, militia. They could be either urban militias, peasant levies, something like that, and they usually, however, didn't prove very effective, especially in those eastern regions, when this peasant levy was known as the Ashariyan, were areas where feudalism had consistently transformed society, for which had disarmed peasants. How it happens also in feudal Europe, that fundamentally the commoners start losing their power, get served, they fight just for their lords, or better, they work for their lords. So in these areas, let's say that levies are kind of weak. In the Persian world, the peasantry is like, it doesn't work on the field. If you look at the Near East, places like, especially the most urbanized areas, like in Syria, Mesopotamia, where are these great cities of thousands and thousands of years of kind of municipal tradition, there are these urban militias that still work somewhat, and they're also relatively effective. Also in that context, it's not that they resolved a big match by themselves, but still they could be a pretty useful complement, especially also to besiege other cities, because when when you fight in areas that are highly urbanized, you tend to even have to make sieges to surround cities, also to have a certain know-how in terms of engineering capabilities. So all the middle classes, the workers, the shoppers, etc., had this know-how. It was like a bit in medieval Europe, like the commoners knew how to make arms, to build up siege weaponry and stuff like that. So that was a useful element. In the Eastern world, was closer to the steppes. There were a few cities. The peasantry was, enslaved by the local lords. Warfare was significantly different, even in environmental terms and etc. So at that point, infantry also was not such a big thing. And so these were runaway troops fundamentally there. There were, however, in some of these areas, like especially in Afghanistan, the borders with India, especially in these mountainous areas, sometimes somewhat also in Anatolia a little bit, in those where they weren't actually very thoroughly Islamicized areas, but there were this medium infantry, I would say, that were pretty effective, because they were usually shepherds, hillmen, troops who were tough, they were a problem, they were a pain in the behind also for the local government. There were still rough troops that could be hired, employed in this difficult terrain, which they knew how to control, etc. So this could be pretty effective, and they were infantry. So even if you look at these dynasties of the Saffarids and the Ghaznavids, the Saffarids ruled between the 9th and the 10th century, the Ghaznavids between the 10th and the 12th. They ruled mostly in this eastern Persia and other areas, like in fact Afghanistan, especially the Ghaznavids. They had their say also into the Indian affairs, etc. They often made use of these infantry troops. Came, in fact, indifferently usually from Afghanistan, from India, where especially Afghanistan, they had pretty tough troops, and those were military traditions that the locals had in pretty rough areas that remained warlike for the same nature, cattle raiding, all this stuff that were at the base of their economy. So yeah, and it's not that things have changed extremely much, telling the truth, up to the last century. Afghanistan was a hell of a place where to fight, in every time in history. And so, at least concluding a video on the military organization of the caliphal armies, there can be a question that can be legitimately posed is, okay, but how large were caliphal armies, like at the peak of caliphal power? Well, it's not easy to, as always, like especially this age, in the early Middle Ages, pretty tough to assess. Sometimes sources actually make these gross exaggerations. You say, okay, well, that's kind of fake. Basically, but it really depends, because one thing is the troops you can have on the field. Well, in that case, you can be sure that historically, at that point, nobody could field like more than 50,000 men at once. And by men, I say men, not actually fighting force, because it's freaking difficult to keep all those people together. You need an enormous logistical apparatus that, unless you're not a very powerful empire like the Abbasid one, at the might of its power, you can't really have. another thing can be the sum of all the troops that you can theoretically mobilize from your provinces, which is another thing. But in this sense, they're even more difficult to assess, because even sources, especially in there, say, okay, well, theoretically we have all these many, okay, but that doesn't really mean that you can field them all at once. It's a wholly another thing. We know that in the Sufyanid Umayyads between the 60s and the 80s of the 7th century had allegedly a regular army of 60,000 men. Is it plausible? Yeah, always given the premises that we have made now. Under Marwan II, so like 60 years later, this number seemingly have doubled under 120,000 troops. Under Harun al-Rashid, between the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 9th, this seemingly has raised to the Caliphal army to 135,000 troops. By the time of Al-Mamun, instead, this army is being reduced. But it doesn't really equate to necessarily, at least, to a decline, because actually rationalizing forces is particularly important. Also, we have practically no idea of what kind of troops these were. I mean, we really made up this army, so it's pretty complicated to answer. In 917, the Caliphal army has seemingly counted 160,000 cavalry and infantry, but that seems just like a bold statement, just saying, okay, we have a lot of guys we can field. Yeah, okay, but what's this number actually? So it's the Fatimid army of Egypt, a part of the Near East, at the time of Al-Mustanzir, in the full of the 11th century, seemingly had 100,000 infantry and 115,000 cavalry. And there is a section of how these troops were actually. There is a list of these troops. Infantry seemingly consisted of 20,000 Muslim. Well, okay, it's a list of tens of thousands of ethnic groups, including here there was an Egyptian. It was the Fatimid Sultanate. So they had Berbers, Moroccans, Ethiopian Negroes, Turks, Persians, Sudanese Negroes, palace guards of mixed origin by the 10,000, then Bedouins, Ifriqians, so Tunisians, Algerians, and other black troops, etc. But the idea is, what the hell, and they're all measured in the number of tens of thousands, at least 10,000. Some have, like the Bedouin cavalry here is counted 50,000, but it's what does that actually mean? It's very difficult, and it's impossible to assess. No army at that time could field 225,000 troops. No army ever. So it's literally impossible. I repeat it to you. If you want it as a general rule, just remember that at this time you can't field more than 50,000 troops, and that normally at this time nobody actually could and actually did. So it would have done more harm than good, actually. Would have been better to split them and to use them separately, and it would have been already a huge effort. So just think that in order to make a campaign just with several thousand troops, you could actually need generations of work in order to find the resources for it, because that's really how much it costs. and it's like that. So 50,000 even is absurd. Can't imagine hundreds of thousands. It's fantasy. There are other notes of color that we can make, like for instance, physicians and surgeons were pretty common into Arab armies, especially from the moment of greater development of the caliphate, where the Muslim world grew effectively, to become a fully kind of to have a statal organization with a permanent army that is particularly important. So here we are between the second half of the 8th and beginning of the 9th century. You have physicians, surgeons attached to the army. There were even litters transported by camels for the wounded being used, and there was, Arab medicine at this time was at the top of, at least in the West broadly meant. So yeah, okay, but the video was rather long by now, and we will surely come to discuss actually all of this sooner or later in more detail, in greater details, or especially looking at the various troops, etc. We have already talked about the tactics. It is still important to look thoroughly at these troops and how they fought, always bearing in mind that the caliphate was enormous extensionally, and the same concept of caliphate is like saying, the empire, like in the West, was theoretically universal, but de facto it was, pretty much loose, and so it also proclaimed his rule over lands that definitely were out of his reach. So this is actually the reality, and the local military traditions varied very consistently. So okay, for now I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.